Hey everybody, we are back with a new startup interview. Get inspired and motivated with Startup Radio Germany.
So, hi there, welcome to another edition of Startuprad.io Germany, this time in English once again. I'd like to welcome our adorable guest, Alyssa. Hi, are you there?
Hi, Startup Radio. Yes, I am.
That is great. So basically, you're here today for several reasons. Because first, you are a foreigner. Secondly, you have your own startup. And thirdly, we got to meet each other before. So basically, that's why I've been asking you to conduct an interview with me. And I think that would be very interesting for everybody who's now listening to this, not sure if to set up a company in Germany or maybe just deciding to which country to go to set up their company.
Great.
Could you tell a little bit about you?
All right, we are Blyss GmbH, and I am a third-generation social entrepreneur. My family comes from Papua New Guinea, and we had coffee plantations and cows and rubber plantations. And that was with my grandparents and my parents. And now in my generation, we are doing chocolate. And I created single bean virgin chocolate, which is a unique way of growing the cacao in Ecuador and processing it all under 50 degrees centigrade and bringing that to market for foodies, writers, and chefs.
So basically, when I would be checking your homepage, Blyss Chocolate, I would not be able to order final chocolate just for in retail amounts.
Yes, you absolutely can. So for foodies, so it's basically for the Feinschmecker, for connoisseurs through to actual cooking chefs. And you can get products for gifts and gift giving, and we have new stuff coming out every month, and a subscription service, as well as professionals who need it for cooking and baking. So, and these are the two use cases mostly for chocolate. Chocolate is either used as a gift or as a luxury that somebody gives themselves or as an ingredient in cooking. So that's exactly what we set ourselves up for.
Wait. There was something that caught my attention. You have a subscription service. That means even though I'm currently working out more and trying to lose weight, but I'm still hungry for chocolate, I can do a subscription with you and get every month, every week, something mailed to me.
That's correct, as of April. Because, this is the interesting thing. Cacao, just like anything from the ground, has vintages and terroirs that influence its taste. So because we work directly on two plantations in Ecuador, we have vintage and terroir-based chocolate. So that means it's not about dark chocolate or light chocolate. That's too banal and stupid. What we have is wet season and dry season cacao from a certain terroir. And we explain which terroir that came from, what were the influences of the weather on that particular land and what season it was. And so therefore we have subscription service that comes out that matches what we grow on the land and then how it comes to your hands. And, it's not about thinking that you have to go to the gym and work off something to earn a luxury chocolate. Because we grow our cacao very, very, very well, she's beautiful, light, fruity, and has nutty nuances, which means we don't need to add sugar or roast her. That's actually our USP in the market. So essentially you have raw, healthy chocolate.
So basically that is another point where my ears kind of tingled, because that means you don't have to add sugar to your chocolate, which means it has less calories.
Yain. That's a really good question. Cacao is botanically a nut. So if you think of an almond, a cashew, a paranus, nuts are basically fat and fiber when you break them down. That's just like cacao. Cacao is exactly a nut. So they have calories, but they are, for example, omega-3 and 6s, which are the good fats for our body. The reason why chocolate is bad and a junk food is because we take literally food of the gods, a beautiful nut, and then, for example, when it's not grown under perfect conditions, it tastes pretty bitter. And there are also genetic species that some are more bitter than others. The bitter ones are actually cheap and easy to grow. So we grow a version called an Arreba Nacional, and she is floral and sweet. So naturally she's more sweet. Secondly, she's a nut, so we just grind her and we keep her, therefore, in her perfect molecular condition, which tastes just like a crushed almond or a crushed pecan nut, obviously in the cacao format. But when you have, for example, if you grow your product under, let's say, hard conditions, not very well, if you choose a cheap, quick growing species, then it will be bitter, and therefore you have to make up for it by adding things like milk and sugar and vanilla and other additives. It's just like everything else we know in the food aisle in a supermarket or in a delicatessen. When it's been grown really authentically, beautifully from a great ground with awesome farmers and kept pure until the point it comes to a shelf, that tastes amazing. Any shortcut will just make it taste bitter.
Okay, so basically, I understood that, and you're basically the second person blowing the same horn that I've interviewed till now with Startuprad.io, because we've been doing in the past an interview with guys from Berlin called Bonaverde, and they are actually they've been telling me almost the same thing, but not about cacao beans, but about coffee beans. And they have a grind, brew, and roast machine. So basically, you put in the pure coffee beans, and then it'll instantly process all of it. So grinding, the roasting, and the brewing all at the same time, and then you get really amazing coffee.
That's great. So therefore, that's like end to end in your hand. So you can be the master of your own quality and how much gets added to or how heavy your roast is. That's fantastic. That's exactly, I think, the type of transparency or the type of control that we want about our food, to know about our ingredients. We are getting diabetic and dying with heart disease because of additives and unnatural things that are being added to our food. So that is a classic example of a great contribution to connoisseurship.
I see. Okay. We've been talking about cacao beans already. Could you, because I've seen this one video where you really amazingly explained the differences in the cacao beans with an example of shoes. I would just like to put this in our notes, so everybody who would like to see this video, get to your homepage and all of this stuff, can just go to www.startuprad.de and they can find it there. Well, now we got a little bit of an idea what you're actually doing. You are providing high quality cacao chocolate to everybody who likes to afford a little bit more for good quality chocolate, right?
Yeah, it's not necessarily about price. It's about connoisseurship. So, for example, there's a difference between consumption and connoisseurship. A person who drinks a lot of wine is an alcoholic. A person who drinks or eats a lot of chocolate, in my mind, is an alcoholic and not what I consider a foodie. Somebody who just says, oh, I only eat 80% chocolate, and then they go out and buy a lot of it and eat a lot of it and say they are, for example, an expert in chocolate. In the wine world, that's considered an alcoholic. The difference is having the nose to know what you like and be discerning to find it. So, for example, just like our vintages with wine, to know that you like particularly the 2011 Chardonnay, or that you know that the Frankfurt that came out in 2009 was particularly sweet because there was such a dry season during August. And that, for example, is connoisseurship and what we're definitely looking to develop in chocolate.
I see. So coming a little bit back to your story, so you're providing this right now here in Munich, from what I understand. You're mailing it, but how did you actually end up there? Because you told me your family is from New Guinea, and then you somehow came to Germany, set up a company in Frankfurt, and then moved to Munich. There's kind of a step in between missing, something Alyssa in New Guinea to Alyssa in Frankfurt. Can you bridge that a little bit for us?
Absolutely. In just before 1910, my grandparents went to Papua New Guinea and they carved out a series of social enterprises, for example, hospital, airline, cattle farming, and rubber plantations. And this was at a time when Papua New Guinea was a colony of Australia. And they set up around Mount Hagen in an area called, our estate was called Ailolo Estate, and it is right in the middle of the Kokoda Trail. which actually has a very political significance for the Oceania region. And this was set up by my grandfather, PJ, and his wife, Gertrude, who actually is a German descendant. So it's funny, we end up closing the loop. They had two gorgeous sons, of which one was my father, and he took over the plantation when he was 21, and he decided to add coffee and grow it quite significantly. And he met a beautiful Australian bride, my mother, and that is actually the background. So we have all of these, and this was back in the times when there was no communication. So they would have to fly mail up and down, and they had no electricity. They had barely functioning satellite communications. And in my mind, that is just wild. And they are working with multiple villages that were traditionally and geographically enemies of each other, and they were working together with them to grow the plantations, and they had government contracts, and they actually had the majority of rubber in Papua New Guinea, so they were doing fantastic. And I'm so impressed, and that was, the basis of my childhood dinner conversations was always my parents talking about the plantations and what was going on and how things grew and the differences between different villages, and my mother working with United Nations and them starting the first, for example, Country Women's Association and developing networks for women to work together, and, for example, payment systems where they would pay families for their work on the plantations, never just the men, because it was also the start of alcohol being introduced into Papua New Guinea. And some of these early, let's say, socioeconomic situations that we see in developing cultures is exactly what my parents lived through. And that was our dinner table conversation for my whole life. And in the middle of the 80s, Papua New Guinea became a republic from Australia. And my family gave over all the plantations back to the villages. And it was great because they'd been working on the plantations for 2 generations anyway, so they knew how everything worked. And my family came and retired in Australia, and the whole farming and plantation world, my father would just go back and help the leaders in charge for managing the continued workings of the plantations. And so then for about 15 years, we did no plantations, and my father sat around in Australia and was extremely bored and didn't really know what to do, and retired. And in the meantime, I had gone to school in Australia because in Papua New Guinea there were no schools, and I was actually a girl, and it was not very safe at that time for me to be there. So I didn't actually grow up there. I grew up in Australia in a very small beach town called the Sunshine Coast. And when my family moved there was not even Ampul, not even a street light. And I think that's the closest thing that they could find that resembled the plantation life in Papua New Guinea. So I was actually schooled in Australia and learned about this thing called the corporate world and universities and degrees. And my brothers and I went through and, let's say, live an industrial life. And we had things like white bread and television and telephones and fax machines and all that great stuff of the 80s and 90s. And I went to university and took corporate jobs and ended up working corporate jobs in Australia in energy and in Germany in telecommunications.
So that is the place where you actually end up in Germany.
That's how I got to Germany. I took a job. And that was the interesting thing because, most parents are probably proud of their children to go to university and get a corporate job. And my father hated it. And he hated that I worked for a corporation and something that he perceived as without soul, although they're all wonderful companies. The companies I worked for are great and charming and delightful and full of human beings with hearts and souls. But in my father's world, that didn't translate to value or meaning, and he was always asking me to do something with soul. And that's probably where it all turned after a decade in corporations. I got ill in my stomach from my lifestyle, and this is a lifestyle I think we all understand, working very long hours, traveling huge kilometers, doing our best at the cost of our own health and our own desires, passions, and happiness. And so I started one day in my little apartment to grind cacao because I was very interested in food science, because the illness I had was actually in my stomach. It was in my intestine area. And so I started looking at food sovereignty and food safety and basically the world food system to wonder why do I feel not so good? What's going on? I'm a good person. I'm doing my best, but somehow my digestive system doesn't work. And so I started to look at, food politics and how it works. And so at nighttime, I would study food politics and food safety. And on the weekends, after my job, I would go grind cacao beans together in my little Altbau and deliver little white packages with handwritten notes on it to my friends saying, here's a chocolate. And I think there's a better food system out there. I think we add things to our food that aren't necessarily there. And the most wonderful industry I could think of disrupting with this idea was chocolate, because we're supposed to love to hate junk food. And why is it junk? And doesn't everything from the earth come out pure? And what happens to the stuff that comes from earth to the stuff that sits on my table in the office? What happens in between there? And why am I getting sick from it? And so that went on for a couple of years of making these things. And my friends are like, yeah, that's cool. But why are you doing this? And I didn't really know. And all I knew is it was something that my father and I could talk about. It was the one piece of communication where he didn't say, I hate your job, I hate your lifestyle.
Good reason.
And yeah, because, he had cancer quite advanced at the time. And it was, health was a topic that we really both took seriously. And I loved that. And so we would talk. And in 2007, I went to Hawaii to compete in the World Championships of the Ironman. And he came and met me there because he didn't even come to Europe. He didn't condone or endorse any of my lifestyle to even visit. But he did come to the Ironman in Hawaii because he thought that was quite cool.
Actually did Ironman.
And so I did the World Championships. It was great. It was hard. It was fun. But let's say, that was, what I was measuring myself by, and, doing these sorts of things, because you always pick different challenges. And so I did that, and he came, and at the end, I sort of looked at him and I'm like, well, what do I do next? Because, when you have goals and you keep ticking them off and you just keep looking for the next thrill, let's say. And we were at like a Whole Foods market, and he's like, just tell me more about this chocolate idea. And what are you doing? What are you grinding? Where is this? And I'm like, well, I need perfect cacao beans to complete this idea of molecular integrity. And he's like, well, like what? And so we literally the next day got in a hire car and drove out to a plantation. We started looking at cacao beans because they happened to be in Hawaii. He's like, show me, I'm the agricultural guy. I'm the guy that grew up in a forest. You can't talk to me about this corporate stuff, but you can talk to me about forests. And I swear that's where our conversation started getting better. And we chatted and we said, all right, I'll go back to Germany and keep doing this sort of soul destroying lifestyle. And you can go to Ecuador and start looking for this cacao bean that I really want, because Ecuador is it's the genetic home for the Arriba Nacional, which was this cacao bean I always wanted. But I didn't want to have to buy it off the market, because I believe that bankers and commodity trade are part of the illness of our political food system. And so he's like, okay. And literally within months, he moved to Ecuador, and he packed 100 items in his backpack. And he backpacked around Ecuador for 2 years, looking for cacao beans and meeting families. And that was, let's say, him coming back to his home. He was finally doing the thing that he loved to do, and he would send samples back to me, and we would talk about it on Skype.
But that is quite an assistant. If you have someone with the relevant experience who's traveling 2 years around in Ecuador to help you kind of scout this area, that is really, really cool.
Absolutely, it's a gift. I mean, there's so many, if you want to be all, let's say, woo-woo and spiritual about it, you could say, meant to be, which actually I am. But, there are too many things that are just coincidental and convenient. And when we open our eyes and see all the opportunities that life gives us, whether we find them convenient or not. For example, it was very inconvenient for me to be having these thoughts about life when I had actually built my whole career and lifestyle in a completely other direction. It wasn't convenient to suddenly say, well, actually, I think I really like growing cacao in Ecuador. And I think I had no skills in food development. I don't even come from gastronomy. It's highly inefficient to think of this way of life. But it was great. My daddy went, and he's just a rock. And my mother stayed in Australia and had, all of her advice about how she bridged, for example, the developing world and first world, which was exactly her experience for 50 years. And that was just wild. And my father was sending samples, and I was cooking away in my little Altbau, and then finally one day the whole thing blew up, and his illness got extremely bad, and I got that horrible phone call that nobody ever wants to get, literally saying that he was dying, and I had to come. And that was the worst phone call of my life, but probably a wake-up call, because I went the next day to my bosses in my corporate job, and I said, like, oh God, something's horrible's happened, and I want to go. I have to go. Please, please help me. And they are an amazing company, like I said, full of heart. And they said, right, go. And literally within 24 hours, I was on a plane to Ecuador, and I saw him, and it was horrible. And he just kept saying, well, you have to do this. This is your time. And when I was there, the doctors looked at my health, and they said the same thing will happen to you in a few years if you don't change. And so that was a hell of a statement. So I ended up staying and living in Ecuador for about a year, and I took up where he left off. And unfortunately, he passed away very quickly, and I stayed and quit my job from Ecuador, and came back and founded Blyss. And I decided to come to Germany to do it. I decided to come back to Germany, of all the places in the world, and make a GmbH.
Okay, and that is
So why
okay.
Germany?
Okay, and now we're going to a bit more of the less personal stuff, more into the little bit more corporate stuff. Is how, how did you actually approach this? How did you know what to do, when to do, who was helping, who wasn't?
Oh. Oh, that's so funny. I came from corporate, right? So I knew Excel, I knew business cases and Excel documents and PowerPoints and strategies. And the biggest mistake I had was making my startup from a corporate perspective. God. And brand strategy and all that stupid stuff. I think I took what corporate gives us, let's say, is a structured way of thinking about, let's say, building a company and implementing it in a market. What corporate unfortunately does is make it a hell of a lot more difficult than it truly is, and it removes our gut instinct from our brain and things like that, and we start to fixate on things like 100-page business cases and things like that, which
Revenue
is
goals.
exactly what I did. Can I just, oh my God, projections, and anybody who's done a startup knows that what happens is never what you expect. And that's obviously, I'd read books that said that, but I didn't expect it. Can I just say my favorite tool right now these days is a thing called a business model canvas. If you've ever seen it, Google it, business model canvas. It is a one-pager where you have in one page exactly your cost and revenues, your value proposition, customers, partners, and customer target group. And if you can't put all that essential information down in a one page and exactly have the breadth from all of that, then basically you're blowing hot air. That's my belief right now. I use the business model canvas every single day. I use it to evaluate partnerships. I use it to evaluate suppliers. That is my one north these
That is
days.
something really funny because I was also thinking about the same stuff, and I have two kind of quotes for you because one, I think it was Eisenhower. He said, "If you want me to start something, to write something, I can start right now. But if you want to have it on one page, give me 1 week."
Yeah, exactly. You have to really distill your thoughts. And I mean, that's the best part, but it also keeps you light and able to move with changes and information as you get it. And when I first started, I was so bogged down and I hired unnecessary people to do unnecessary things because I thought somehow other people knew more than what I did because I didn't know how to do everything. And that's again, I think, a huge mistake somebody has. If you have technically entrepreneurialism runs in my family, and especially social entrepreneur, which is that space between charity and full profit. We see a black zero being giving back to the earth and our people. And that is in my blood I'm the third generation of that, but still I had to learn some of those basics again, which is literally in the end, trusting your stomach and making your whole structure so light and floating that as market and supply and customers shift,
Exactly,
you can
and
move
you
with
don't
it.
need PowerPoint because that's the second quote I've heard. And since I'm full-time consultant, it really made me laugh a lot because it's that basically PowerPoint is a tool with which you can say in 20 minutes what you otherwise would have said in 2 minutes, but you need to work 1 week for that.
Absolutely. Absolutely. That's the thing, making things more complex than they need to be.
So how was it actually to come to Germany and set up a company? Did you just go to some office, some public administration and ask, "Hey guys, how should I do it?" Or did you work with consultants, or how did you do it?
Well, that was part of the hiring more people to do more things that were really not necessary. So I got great lawyers and accountants and export advisors and import advisors and all of that sort of stuff very quickly at the beginning, and that absolutely helped. I went to places like the American Chamber of Commerce and international business groups asking them for advice. That was, let's say, to put it honestly, advisors were no help compared to going just straight to authorities. And that's what I do now. I think the German authorities, there's a place called an Ordnungsamt, which means like an audit department, and the Finanzamt, the finance department, and IHK,
Chamber of Commerce,
Industrie
yeah.
Handelskammer, which is the Chamber of Commerce. Those three places should be the holy trinity of where new
That
business
is
should
so
start.
funny. A foreigner says about to
The IHK, the Ordnungsamt, and the Finanzamt is the Holy
Finanzamt,
Trinity.
the Holy Trinity.
They are, I can tell you exactly why. For starters, they are damn smart. They have seen everything before, whereas, for example, advisors and consultants hadn't. And I had advisors and consultants sitting in front of me looking up IHK books, trying to find Kakaoordnungs and things like that. That was putting a layer in between is like putting a pillow over your ear and trying to listen to what's being said to you. Even, yeah, that's the thing. Let's say the German amts are really knowledgeable. They have people who've been there for a very long time. I mean, we like to make jokes about that, right? But there is actually Beamte, but the value of people being in their jobs for a very long time, doing the same thing over and over, means they're experts. And I think if you can come in with an open heart and a humble hand and say, look, this is what I would like to try to do, they are so kind, so helpful, so smart, because I think two reasons. Firstly, they're sick of I don't know, I can't think of a word that's not rude, idiots that come in and are just rude to them and treat them with less respect. And, so if you just go in nicely asking for help and not wanting to somehow maneuver your way through whatever their bureaucratic requirements are, if you just go in saying, what is it? They will happily give it because you're nice. And the second thing is they don't want to have to clean up your mess in the end. These are beautiful human beings with hearts and souls. And I don't believe anybody gets joy out of having to deliver Mahnungs and bad news. I don't know anybody. I never met anybody in any German amt that got joy from that. And I think somehow there's, a different reputation out there. They have expertise and they want to give it. They just, want to be spoken to and approached just like every other profession. And I think that was the easiest and the fastest thing I could learn. And I learned that the hard way, for example, with the Finanzamt. I got, for example, like every new company, you get a very early VAT audit, you get a very early tax audit. And I would receive stuff, and then my lawyer and my accountant would sort of tell me what that meant, and I still wouldn't get it because, of course, I come from another culture. So the easiest thing was I just called them and I said, "Can I come over for a cup of coffee?" And you tell me, and would you like to come to my atelier and have a look and see what we're talking about? And that was perfect. That was the easiest thing. The ice just went, it melted like crazy. Or even in the beginning when I started up, I called the Ordnungsamt and I said, "I would like to make a cacao atelier, like a chocolate atelier here in Frankfurt. Can you come with me and look at places with the Immobilien, with the real estate guy?" And they did. They spent a whole day. Two guys from Ordnungsamt came and visited like 8 places with me and said, yes, no, no, yes, yes. And then they told me why. And their reasons why were perfect because it's because of sanitary conditions, because of working conditions. And they did that for free. Like, hello. That's brilliant. So then whenever we did things, we just called the guys we knew and said, "Oh, this is what we're doing." And they're like, "Yeah, haken dran. Tick, go forth and conquer,
That was
little
actually
one."
from the Frankfurt Ordnungsamt. That was really something that I would describe as service, right?
Absolutely. And with joy, I mean, these guys, they know their stuff. And so when you go ask them and they tell you, then they feel beantwortet, they feel met. And I think we all just want to feel a little recognition for what we do as being valuable. And, when that happens, when somebody tells me they like my chocolate, I go out of my way to do even more because I feel like somebody recognizes what I've done as being valuable. And that's just a human condition.
Exactly. I also like the Ordnungsamt
So,
because they every other week they delivering me a personal note that says pay $20 for wrong parking.
yeah. There's reasons and rhymes. And, I don't agree with all of the bureaucracy that exists here, but it's not my job to agree or disagree. I figure there are sometimes decisions that are made that are outside my level of understanding now. And it's probably either in terms of greater good or it's probably in future change projects. Like I come from corporations, I know how hard it is to move giant elephants, and I certainly don't underestimate their job. And there's a country of 80 something million people here. That's I come from a tiny country of like 5 people. We have colonies of England and Anglo-Saxon countries naturally have in them a DNA that's oriented around more change and flexibility, just culturally and also by the mass of their population. We can't expect that from different cultures in the same way. And that's certainly for, let's say, any Antipodean or Anglo-Saxon that will come and do work in Germany or try to set up a company. It will appear like the worst place on earth, like an apocalyptic state by the amount of pessimism and bureaucracy that you can perceive. But it's a mindset
Exactly.
shift.
And when we've been trying to record this interview back in the days, shortly before Christmas, when it was just due to my problems with the idea that was actually not recorded, um, you've been saying that the thing that made you happy was it takes some time to set things up here in Germany, but then they're basically running smooth like clockwork.
Absolutely. The thing about doing business in Germany is it is rock solid. From the amts, from the departments to the market. And for example, in Germany, people don't like you immediately. That's for sure. They take their time to decide if they like you or not.
Very
That's
German.
very different to an
Yes.
Anglo-Saxon. Absolutely. And I think, certainly Antipodeans, we come from, sunshine and happiness. We can take that as a very big blow to we perceive that as pessimistic, we see that as cold, but I see it as earning trust and respect. And therefore, when you do, the roots are deep. It's not like this Anglo-Saxon society where you meet somebody at a networking event and they're like, wow, I love what you do. We should have coffee sometime. And coffee sometime never happens. And they actually weren't really listening to what you're saying. Whereas in Germany, for example, if somebody says, let's have coffee sometime, they have their calendar out and they're literally asking you, should next Tuesday be a good date? I mean, you are fixed to things, and the meaning when somebody stands behind you, if it's a department, if it is a consumer, if it is a partner, they will be there. they will never commit themselves when they don't believe it. And if I'm going to invest my entire life savings into a startup, I want it to be a place that's rock solid. And if it means it's a bit hard at the beginning, that they tell me, I don't like you, or I don't like what you do, or I don't understand, and that makes it a little bit harder for me to kind of, get through the door, then I would rather that they tell me that at the beginning than at the end when I've invested my life and soul into something that somebody blew hot air up my ass for. That is, the German system is rock solid for that. Because whatever you do, if you can move a rock here, it will move, and you will be able to return from that. And that is definitely more safe than I would ever put in an American or a UK or an Antipodean-based company.
Mm-hmm. I see. So that is
As well as
okay.
market mass. Market
Okay.
mass is another thing.
How do you actually how do you actually perceive the European Union? Because I think for you it's a big thing. If you're located in Munich, I think you're surely shipped to Switzerland, to Austria, to Italy, and all around Europe at least. So is it a good thing for you, or is it a bad thing for you, this common market?
Oh, it makes zero difference. We actually ship. It makes, to be honest, makes no difference if we're in Frankfurt or Munich, because our customers are very international, from India, the Middle East, from Europe. We're just not terribly interested in the Americas. So for us, we needed reliable logistics, and that is DHL, Hermes, and UPS. So it makes no difference about currencies because the tax elements are the same. Because we have a pure product and a very transparent manufacturing process, we have all the certifications for halal, kosher, vegan, diabetic friendly, organic. That was very easy for us to get and maintain. So our product, naturally, by how it's made and how we think, is very global. So the only thing is it takes a couple more days to get to India than it takes to get to Italy. And that's another thing, when you make a GmbH out of Germany, that offsets our little risk in Ecuador, because in Ecuador we are quite solid because we're a German company. And I often use the statement, guys, we can or cannot accept that. Sorry, because we're a German company. So it's a great thing. I use that whole quality and reliability element as a way not only to work with our suppliers and relationships, and the AMTs, the departments in Ecuador, because we need export help out of there and reliability with their flights services, but also with our customers in India, Middle East, and Southern Europe. They absolutely love. I say that we have German
So
standards. That's why we're
basically,
here.
you
So
found it to be
I
yeah,
use
you
brand
found it to be
Germany.
helpful to use the German image.
Absolutely. But that's a great thing, because I really say, if I get an import here to Germany, and we haven't done, because we have a triple quality testing, we make sure the humidity and the hydration levels of the cacao is a certain, exactly what I want. And I tell them, you know what, if it is not exactly how I want when it's departed exports in Ecuador, I make a test upon import in Germany, and I will send everything back. And it is great because the Ordnungsamt in Germany are fantastic, and they really do back up my claims, because I need to have a certain level of magnesium, calcium, and sulfur and theobromine in my cacao, because it proves that it's not being over roasted over 50 degrees centigrade. I prove the genetic species of what we work with. I prove that there's no child labor, because we don't have traces of blood and animal feces on our product. It's these little tiny things that I need the anstrengende, the very strict controls of Germany, to work with, because I cannot trust that level of testing anywhere else. So one, we use it as a USP, both with our supply and also with our customers, but I rely on it. I rely on it like crazy. I've done little tests. Even Italian chocolate makers are using the same Ordnungsamt in Frankfurt that I am using, because they're just great. They're hard, but they're great.
What would be the recommendation you would give to someone who's now listening to this interview and thinks, Germany may not be so bad, thinking about setting up my company there? What would be the best advice you can give this person?
make themselves aware of how much all of their decisions will cost them. If they come from Anglo-Saxon countries, they're used to a limited liability company not having the same overhead as it does in Germany. What I mean is a GmbH costs a lot of money in administration and accounting and accountability. So making the decision about what their legal structure is, there is a UG at the moment, which is a €1 or
yes.
€1 type company. Correct. That costs, for example, over a year only about €1,000 to maintain, whereas when you have a GmbH, you're looking easily between 10 and 20,000 euros just with the maintenance of the accounting fees and the submissions you have to do. So that is a huge decision
but actually,
to make.
this UG is also not totally free of all those duties, only of some. And basically, you always have to add money to avoid them running out of money because, for example, to set up a company like that, it costs you a few €100 and you need to put this in the company and then the company can pay for that. So it's also this kind of very special German system you've been always talking about, this reliability, this kind of strict order and all this stuff.
Absolutely. I mean, well, that's the thing, to start a GmbH, you have to have 20,000. And then it costs you between 10 and 20,000 to maintain it, even, just the simple stuff. So there is your 30 to 40,000 a year just in structure. So that's something that people really have to consider, but it's reliable and it means something. It really means something to have a reliable, compared to an LLC that basically anybody can get and do, or a proprietary limited. When you want to have customers who take you seriously, and we have, for example, royal customers in different countries, and they need to know when we go through their royal procurements, or even large corporations that have really fixed procurement processes, that's absolutely something that you have to do. Now, that might seem really weird because we are a social enterprise. So 100% of my costs go into the maintenance of a sustainable future. Let's put that in perspective. 15% of our entire costs go on regulatory processes. Mm-hmm. That's a lot. That is a lot. When you relate it to 21% we spend on the earth and 24% we spend on people development. So I can definitely say there are some, for us, the big mission, which is to influence the reduction of diabetes and heart disease by making a proof point of chocolate that can actually show food sovereignty, security in environmental systems and development of villages a much better way. It's, let's say, a very long way of going around the corner, but it's definitely more reliable and safe than even a not-for-profit organization. So I think being really clear about what your big goals are and what you're prepared to do to get there and how seriously you want to be taken, I think that is the biggest decision you make when you're coming to Germany. And why you would use a certain legal structure, why you would use Germany. That has to be part of the strategy. Otherwise, it's just a giant pain in the ass. and you have to go through all that care. So it's definitely got to be a strategic decision. And so, for example, even Germany hasn't even been, we only start this year as year 5, targeting the German market, even as a consumer group. So it can be a really long way around.
I see, but you're still in favor of that.
Absolutely. So, even though I can say 15% of our, let's say, cost of goods sold goes on regulatory processes, that's worth it because, we're benefiting from the seriousness of what we're doing. And because our big goal is to influence some food sovereignty and food safety elements, we need to have the backup between what we're doing. And I think, anybody that's doing anything that takes people's lives in their hands, if they're building machinery or if they're making food, anything that really has a liability, definitely choose somewhere like Germany, because when you get through all the hoops, you're going to be safe. And I think that's always something that an entrepreneur wants to have in their mind. We start our companies because we're driven by a passion to bring something out that's going to, have a legacy beyond our lives. And when you know that you've got, for example, you're in a country or you have to abide by a system that might be a bit hard at first, but you know that makes it sustainable. Hell yeah. Hell yeah. That's the opposite of this whole .com era that we've just come through. That's the opposite of second mortgages and bankers creating value out of nothing. And I think that's what an entrepreneur will crave for, to take their own life in their hands and make something that means something.
I would also like to agree with you on that. And with that, I'd also like to wrap up the interview. It was a lovely time. I laughed and smiled a lot. And I really do hope our listeners also do that as well when they're listening to this podcast.
Thank you very much for sharing time. Power to all the startups.
Thank you very much.